some of the details of licensing and what they can do about indecent material, etc. I want to walk you through with some important cases just where telecommunications in that broad sense falls under First Amendment protection. If you want to think back, reminisce on all the wonderful weeks we've had in class this semester and all the fascinating areas of media law that we have looked at. We've looked at issues of libel. We've looked at invasion of privacy. We've looked at copyright. We've looked at access rights and restrictions. All areas that we've looked at so far apply to both print media and telecommunications. Why is that? Remember, even in libel, defamation suits, you no longer sue separately for slander for the spoken word. Why is it that up until now, it really didn't matter much what medium we're talking about? Whether we're talking about online, whether we're talking about traditional newspaper, why would that be?
Convergence?
Well, convergence is an extraordinarily important phenomenon that we study. And we normally don't talk about it in this term, but I think that's a good way to introduce it, in the idea that the same rules basically apply, regardless of the medium. Until we get to what we know broadly as telecom. So understand that there is a difference between what we've looked at so far, that covers all these different areas of mass media, and specifically regulations for telecommunications. Okay. So, if I were to ask you what area of media enjoys the greatest degree of First Amendment protection, meaning has the most power to block, to act as that shield against government's attempt to repress speech and expression, what would you say falls under that? Okay, you're getting very narrow here. Let's just think about medium, the medium. Obviously, going all the way back to Alexander Michaelshon and what we have just seen in terms of commercial speech, what came out of the New York Times, B. Sullivan in terms of political speech, etc. Right? Print, okay. Why so much First Amendment coverage for print?
Because it's the oldest and most straightforward compared to digital media.
It is certainly the oldest. It was all that was in existence at the time of the writing of the Bill of Rights. And remember, everything that we talked about in terms of that, really that first area of law that we looked at, just how far the government can encroach upon free expression rights. And it became narrower and narrower and narrower. But one thing, such as prior restraint, the courts have for a very, very long time said, well, it's the most egregious area of censorship. But there have been attempts to determine just where First Amendment falls in terms of other areas of other mediums of communication. So let's look at broadcast, which again is traditionally what we're talking about in telecommunications. Why would broadcasting, where does it fall, do you think, first of all? More First Amendment protection, less First Amendment protection, the same?
Say less.
less, why?
The FCC.
Okay, because we actually have an agency of government. What type of, remember we talked about sources of law? We'll try as much as I can to help you for that comprehensive exam. What is this?
That would be like the executive.
That would be under
It's like
administrative law, right? It comes out of the executive branch. So we actually have agencies that can regulate broadcasting in ways that it never could print. And while this has been an idea that has been well versed over the years in terms of why, it really came to a head in a 1969 case. Red Lion Broadcasting versus FCC. And again, I do not care that you know the specifics of the case. It's just an extraordinary, it's a watershed moment. And it basically had to do with rules that the FCC then had in place that required equal time for people who had been attacked on the air by somebody else, particularly during a political campaign. And Red Lion Broadcasting Corporation said we shouldn't have to adhere to these type of regulations if a newspaper doesn't have to. What is the famous case dealing with a newspaper having First Amendment rights not to have to run anything?
Is it the Miami Herald?
Versus
Yeah, I don't know.
Tornillo. Miami Herald versus Tornillo, 1972. Yes, very good. So we see in Miami Herald that the court said what? Forcing a newspaper to run a response to an editorial is a violation of that newspaper's what? First Amendment rights, okay? In Red Lion Broadcasting 69, they tried to argue the same thing, that forcing broadcast stations to run that type of response is in violation of the First Amendment. The Supreme Court said absolutely not. That in fact, newspapers have fairly unlimited amounts of First Amendment protection. Obviously, you can sue after the fact for libel or invasion of privacy, or et cetera. But broadcasting, for certain reasons that we're going to get into in just a second, has the least amount of First Amendment protection of any of the mediums. So traditional broadcasts, and very few people probably of your age group, how many of you have even turned on a television set in the last week or so? You know, I wouldn't have had to go back to 10 years teaching here, and everyone would have said, well, of course, the first thing I do when I go home from your class, I've got to get you out of my head some way, Dr. Hicks, so I turn on, you know, Ren and Stimpy or whatever it is.
Been a minute, yeah.
There you go. Beavis and Butthead, that would have been the one probably at one point that would have cleansed me from some of the students' mind. But nowadays, so many of us don't even turn on television. We get everything off of the internet. However, why do you think that in Red Lion versus FCC, the Supreme Court said broadcasting does not enjoy the level of First Amendment protection that print does, and it can be subject to significant regulation. Yes, say that again. Sure. Why do you think that the Supreme Court ruled in Red Lion versus FCC that no, ruled against Red Lion, you do not have the same rights of First Amendment protection enjoyed by print, that you can, in fact, you have the least amount of any medium. And again, 1969, so we were well before the internet. So we were before cable here, so we're primarily talking about print and broadcast. Someone else, what do you do?
I mean, it's a totally different, more powerful form of medium, so I guess they want to really regulate the influence it could have.
Okay, we are actually going to see cases where the issue of the pervasiveness and the ubiquity, what do those two words mean? Pervasiveness and ubiquity.
Got me on ubiquity.
Pervasive, like, sense.
This is a stretch, but like, when you read something, you choose to read it, and
Okay.
like, if
Yeah.
you're hearing or seeing something, sure, you can choose to hear or see something, but at the same time, it can just kind of infiltrate your life without
Yeah.
you deciding to see or hear it.
Indeed. Pervasiveness basically means the power to, basically have power to reach you. It is pervasive. If you walk into a room where a television or radio is on, what must you do, la 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 la, in order to, well, even if you choose not to watch it, if it's simply background, you can still hear it. What does ubiquity mean? If something is a ubiquitous nature. It's everywhere. We can't escape it. In fact, in one of the cases, I doubt that we'll get to it today, it'll probably be on Thursday. How many people have heard of the late comedian George Carlin? What is he most famous for in regards to the FCC? Profanity. The word you may not use on the air. Actually, the court said that the reason that the FCC could regulate such a thing, and you don't have to write this down now, but we'll get through it on Thursday, is because of the pervasiveness and ubiquitousness of radio. In fact, the person who, this is too interesting not to bring it up right now, so don't worry about it until Thursday. The person who filed the first lawsuit was a father who had picked his son up from school, I mean, his grade school age boy, and he had on a Pacifica radio, and before he could even turn it off, his son had heard all the 7 words you cannot say on broadcasting. So he didn't even have a chance to protect his son from that. And I will tell you, I've had students before ask if they could get extra credit for either writing or reciting those words. No, you may not. We will see them in the file.
On the quiz, will you be expecting us to know the precedent of that case?
Yes, yes.
So could you summarize the precedent for me?
Broadcasting does not enjoy the same degree of First Amendment protection as print. It's subject to serious government regulation.
So it basically could be said broadcast and print have different rights when it comes to the
Indeed.
First Amendment.
Indeed. Remember that for print, prior restraint is almost impossible.
Yeah.
We have case after case showing that. Now, you can, after the fact, sue for libel, sue for privacy, other areas of law, other torts. But that gives a tremendous amount of leeway, and a tremendous amount of power to print whatever they want. I mean, typically they would want to be safe and not, just knowingly publish lies. Even if they publish lies, with the actual malice standard, public figures, look what bar they have to reach in order to successfully sue for libel. Not the case in broadcasting. Why do you think? So we have the idea of the ubiquitousness, the fact that it is everywhere, and the pervasiveness. power to reach where you may not even want it to reach. As Caitlin said, you have to pick up a book or a magazine or a newspaper and choose to engage in that. Let's go back in time a bit and look at the original reasons why Congress, in all of its wisdom, decided to create a system whereby broadcasting is heavily regulated, very much unlike print. There is something called the scarcity rationale. What does it mean to be scarce? Which seems kind of awkward after we've just said that it's ubiquitous. What does it mean for something to be scarce?
Hard to find.
Hard to find. There's a limited amount of it, right? What do you think at the turn of the 20th century lawmakers in this country were thinking about when they talked about broadcasting being a scarce resource?
Radios, probably.
Radio, and what about it specifically?
Who could afford one, who have one,
Okay,
or who has access?
that has become a big debate among scholars, and it's become a big debate among people who work in regulation, but it wasn't their issue at that point. I heard someone else over here. Now, I'm not a technical person, as probably most of you know. But the scarcity rationale has to do with the radio spectrum, which seems quaint in today's broadband world. But what is the radio spectrum?
The frequencies at which you can hear radio stations?
Yeah, the frequencies the frequency is a man-made term, but there's actually a physical spectrum
Yeah.
through which you can send broadcast signals, right? And it is limited. You cannot create more of it. So one of the reasons why it should be regulated is because there's only so much of it. What are we going to do when it runs out? What happens when there are too many competing interests wanting to use that same part of the spectrum? How many of you have ever taken a cross-country trip and you're between strong signals of radio? What do you hear? Or if you're in Texas, you hear a lot of gospel music. That's all I can tell. Driving home. Sirius was the best investment I ever made for long car trips. But for terrestrial radio, what they call the traditional radio stations, when one station is trying to broadcast on the same part of that spectrum as another one is, that's when you get that chaos. Until the power of one overtakes the power of the other. Okay. Who else at that time, we're talking about the early 1900s, who else was dependent upon that radio spectrum? We call it sometimes the radio spectrum, the broadcast spectrum.
The military?
The military, yes. Why would they be interested in it?
To hear aliens.
Communication. To hear what, Lashonda?
Oh, I said to hear aliens.
To hear aliens, okay, well, we've always wanting to hear for, I mean, you all know that's what we're doing. We know that we can't ever communicate, so we've just been for decades just listening to see whether we hear anything. Really quite fascinating, actually. How many people in here believe in aliens? seen one? Has anyone had a close encounter?
Can we say unidentified objects, not aliens? I believe in that.
Okay, we can do that. We can do that. I apologize for that.
No, it's fine.
Okay. Ship-to-shore communication, ship-to-ship communication. You know, it's a huge benefit in wartime. And we're just shortly before World War I here. It's a huge benefit to suddenly be able to use the airwaves to communicate. Before, what did one ship have to do to communicate with the other?
Send a pigeon.
Send a pigeon may sound funny, but in fact, they did use pigeons as carriers. But oftentimes, what did they use? They used
Telegraph.
They used the telegraph, which relied upon cables, and they used Morse code through lights.
What about the cup and string?
The cup and the string, yeah. Oh, I've forgotten about that. I love that. You're too young. You never played with the cup and string.
I'm seeing it on TV.
Actually, my favorite cup and string toy is the one, you know, like Stewie had, where you're trying to get it. Have you ever seen that, the ball on the cup? I entertained myself for hours as a child. Again, I was from Texas, so that explains a whole lot here. Scarcity. We want to, I mean, this is a capitalist country. The idea was, let's let people make money off of the radio spectrum. However, we need to protect part of it for military purposes. At this particular time, people were setting up their own broadcast stations left and right, and interfering with military. So the idea was broadcastable. What do we do with that? So it's scarce. It's also, there were two big rationales. One is radio spectrum, the radio spectrum scarcity rather, and the other is, you want to think of what that might be? What is the nature of that radio spectrum? It is, yeah. This is as much as I know about it. There isn't a way to kind of illustrate it like that, like a rainbow. What else about it? What is the nature of it?
Can't see it.
You can't see it, no?
Communication.
Let's think about that capitalist idea. I don't know why I pointed to you as a capitalist. Let's think about that capitalism. What do you, if you're interested in making money off of something, what is your first concern?
People are getting it for free.
Who what?
Who's gonna buy it?
Who owns it, right? Congress very early on said that this is a public resource. The radio spectrum belongs to the American people. So there's the idea that yes, we're going to let private entities make money off of it, but taxpayers should in fact get some benefit from it. Eventually that came in the form of licenses. You have to, unlike starting a newspaper or a magazine, you have to have a license to broadcast, to use that scarce public resource. Okay. Make sense so far? This is, I started with this idea of the pervasiveness and the ubiquitousness, I can't pronounce it. Pronunciate. I didn't even say that right. Because those are much more contemporary in our minds of why broadcasting would be not guaranteed the same degree of personal protection. These are really the original ideas. So, any questions up till now? So little bit of history. First time Congress got involved in the regulation of broadcasting was through the Radio Act of 1912.
So that's the first time Congress got involved.
Yes, in the regulation of that, of broadcasting. Again, the major purpose of this avoid disrupting military transmissions. And it was fairly limited. The only major requirement of the Radio Act of 1912 was that all radio transmitters be licensed by the federal government. And that anyone who wanted to operate a radio station get a license. The most important thing is that the idea was to avoid the disruption of military transmissions. Remember, we're right on the cusp of World War I here. Required licensing. For the first time ever, required licensing. Okay. So, did that do the trick? Everything was perfectly fine? No problems? No. Not at all. Licensing itself did not do enough because as early as 1926, and you don't have to know this date, there were more than 1,000 pirate radio operators in this country. People who refused to get the license. Unregulated. And we saw major problems with stations encroaching upon the signals of other stations and interfering with military broadcasts and military transmissions. Congress faced at this point three choices. They said we have to regulate. We have to do more than the Act of 1912 provided. And the three choices were creating an entirely public system of broadcasting. Each of these options were vigorously debated in Congress. This would be one, a system in which all broadcast outlets would be owned and operated by the federal government. Many countries around the world opted for this. They were going to the same issue in the developed world. Great Britain, for one. It's only been a mid-20th century phenomenon of independently owned networks, etc., in the UK. Before that, it was what? The BBC, British Broadcasting Corporation. How many people know how people pay? You know, we have a system whereby what pays for broadcast?
Advertising.
Advertising. What did you have to do for the longest in Great Britain?
Probably tax funds.
Every time you bought a radio or later a television, you paid a tax on it, and then you paid a yearly tax on it that allowed you access to public broadcasting. And everything was publicly broadcast.
Personal licensing.
Yes. Yes. A different system. Some would say better, some would say worse. Different. Okay, so that was one choice they had. The project was simply let the marketplace take care of this. No government intervention whatsoever. And when there are disputes between different licensees, take them to court. Let the courts handle it. Get government out of broadcasting. That was a serious consideration. And the third, privately owned, but with regulations. And obviously, that is the choice that Congress went with. Okay.
What's that 1,000 mean again?
Even after the Radio Act of 1912, which tried to prevent the confusion, there were still over 1,000 unregulated, unlicensed broadcasters in the United States. So it was still a mess.
Ouch. After all that work.
Well, there are still, to this day, there are pirate radio stations that operate, low-power pirate radio stations. College campuses are known. Is there one here? I don't know about it, but college campuses were always known as somebody in someone's dorm room would get together and run a very low-powered, illegal radio station. Yeah.
I'm actually going into a possible radio career, so
Yeah.
I've definitely heard about
Yeah.
that before.
Pirate radio. Okay. So they amended the Radio Act of 1912 to the Radio Act of 1927. They maintained the licensing requirements from 1912, but they created the Federal Radio Commission and formally divvied up the radio spectrum. I'm gonna try my hand at a rendering of the radio spectrum. Although, as Ben pointed out, it is invisible, we can't see it.
You said they created the Federal Radio Commission.
Radio Commission.
What was that after?
And divvied up places on the spectrum. So they would say, okay, we are going to maintain this much for military. So only the military can broadcast within that part of the spectrum. And then it did the same thing for private, depending upon where you were, how far you were broadcasting, etc. And the purpose of this was so that two equally powered stations, or one station that had a license and one that didn't, within the same community, wouldn't overlap and create all kinds of problems. Static, basically, is all you would get. Who in here has a local radio station you can just love? WSIE, right?
Yeah.
So smooth.
Who is just devoted to a station? The minute you get in your car, you have to turn this station on. It is life or death. You can't do it.
Well, never mind. Actually, I really like Lewis and Clark's. Like theirs is
Okay.
really good. I
Okay.
put that on a lot.
Okay, so Lewis and Clark. So you're not loyal to SIUE?
I'm not.
So, but let's say you're listening to Lewis and Clark, and they ask them, what is their genre?
It's largely like our students kind of play a lot of like what
Okay.
they want. So I usually listen like Monday nights, like after 9. It's like a lot of just like local bands. It's a lot
Okay,
of, like,
so you're listening to a really cool local band, and then suddenly, and this is, welcome to WSIE.
I don't want that. No.
You wouldn't want that, would you?
So jazz is too smooth.
That's what this, too jazzy.
It's too smooth, yeah.
Okay, that is exactly what, it's called a sound now.
Yeah. I need to agree.
That's exactly what they did. in Radio Act of 27, they said, we're gonna divide this. Protect so much for military transmissions, and then say, if you have a license, and again, I'm not gonna get into all the technicalities of this because I don't understand them myself. But if you have a license within a certain geographic area, you pay for that license, we're going to grant you this part of the spectrum on which to broadcast. And nobody else can use it. Okay?
I could be wrong on this, but wouldn't that be like with TV satellites for like not viewing something in your area, you need to like purchase to be able to view it? Is that kind of what that is, or?
Well, we didn't.
I could be wrong.
Well, see, satellites are very different.
Okay,
Satellites
okay.
are not considered a public resource. Satellites are properties of either the government, through like NASA or the military, or they're private. They're privately owned.
Okay.
AT&T has lots of satellites up there.
Okay, that's why I said I could be
Yeah.
wrong, because satellites are
Yeah.
different.
Yeah. Very shortly after this, in 1934, the FRC became the FCC that we know today. And that was because of the addition of other forms of electronic communications, including telephone. And very shortly thereafter, television in the very earliest stages. And the FCC took up many different roles in relationship to broadcasting. One was exactly what I did in that drawing called spectrum allocation. So that's a new role at the FCC, making sure that licensees are permitted only one part of that spectrum. Another function was what they call band allotment, and that is deciding how many stations could exist in any given geographic area. So how many stations could St. Louis have? How many stations could Milwaukee have? How many stations could Chicago have? And channel assignment. So actually taking a licensee, you have been granted a license, and we're going to tell you which number you may use to broadcast on. So this was set up as the initial 3 major obligations. And of course, all 3 of them have to do with licensing. Which, here's something to remember. This would be an excellent question for the comprehensive exam. Licensing is, without question, the most powerful, important, I need to put another adjective in there, between powerful and power. I was going to say powerful power. Most powerful, most important function of the FCC. This is the true power. We will see on Thursday where they do have the power to regulate what is broadcast and to impose fines. Remember Janet Jackson's wardrobe malfunction? Yeah. Well, you don't remember it, you're young, but you heard about it from people, etc. I actually happened to be sitting all alone at a party. All the other people had gone into the other room to do something, and I'm like, what happened? What happened? And I'm like trying to explain to them what happened. So we do know that they can in fact censure, they can fine, they can deal with content regulation, which we're not going to talk about until Thursday. But the most important power they have is their ability to license. And licensing refers to, or entails rather, allocation, allotment, and assignment. Yes, sir.
Okay, channel assignment is the, they give you the actual number station that you
Yeah,
broadcast on?
you get 88.7, you get 103.9, whatever it happens to be. So how much of the spectrum is going to be allocated to commercial versus military versus anything else? How many stations are in each geographic area? And then where you as a licensee land. So now, who in here wants to, as a career goal, own a radio station or a television station?
That'd be dope.
Anybody?
Maybe.
It
Depends on what
used to be called, once you were granted a license, it was a license to print money. You make a lot of money off it, but they're not easy to get.
Right.
So, for licensing, the FCC has certain guidelines. If you want to be a part of this, you want your part of that spectrum for your own commercial use. Again, that spectrum allocation, it was during that time that they said, okay, here's how much is going to be for public radio, public television. So if you're wanting a commercial license, they're going to look for several characteristics. 5 major categories. One involves technology. You must be able to demonstrate to the FCC when you're applying for a license that you can abide by all FCC guidelines regarding standards of technology, facilities, signal quality, etc. You have to be able to say, I can hire people like engineers who know what they're doing. I know what to get, how to use the equipment in order to fulfill all of their guidelines. The second is financial. You must have capital on hand to support your proposal. This is why, the main reason it's hard to get a license, but you pretty much have to be rich before you can. You actually have to show that you can operate for so long without ever making a profit and still maintain the station. Real quick. I know all of you could pass this requirement. You must be of good moral basically, what does that mean? You lack any serious legal problems, legal convictions, etc. You don't have to have a note from your mother. No, that's he's a good person. You're a good guy. Wes deserves that radio station. He's a good guy. He's one of the good ones. Yeah. Technology, financial, character. Under financial, to be very specific, you have to be able to show that you could operate for 3 months without making any profit whatsoever and survive. Again, that's why it's only the rich and corporations that can afford this. Okay. You must be a U.S. citizen. Or if it's a company, you must have less than 25% foreign ownership. Now keep in mind, don't let your mind wander to networks. I'm an Adult Swim fan, CNN. This is only broadcast stations, radio stations, television stations. Okay, so technology, you have to show that you know what you need, that you know how to hire the people who can run a station. You have to show that you can operate it. You have the funds to operate it for at least 3 months without any profit coming in. You have to show that you have good moral character, primarily meaning that you don't have any serious legal problems. You must be a U.S. citizen, 25% or less if it's a foreign ownership, if it's a corporation. Yes?
I don't know if this is a dumb question. Does this apply to AM and FM?
Yes.
Okay.
Those are that's just a split.
Okay.
Yes. Okay. Now, remember I said that there were 5? Everyone can count the 4 here. The necessity to show that you have plans in place to hire and promote women and minorities.
But not foreigners?
No. No. However,
Weird.
it gets worse than this. In the 1980s, they got rid of that. You no longer have to show that you have a plan in place to hire and promote women and minorities.
So who's getting it?
You should know that that's the one that they got rid of. Yeah.
Oh my.
And this is really just the beginning of what we're going to go over on Thursday, and that is the decline from the early 80s, the Reagan administration, all the way through today, through administrations of both parties, of fewer and fewer and fewer and fewer regulations. Almost going to that idea of just let the marketplace take care of it. Yeah.
So, in order for them to remove that 5th necessity for licensing, was there like a specific case?
No, the FCC, the commissioners of the FCC just decided to do it.
Really?
Yep. And from my memory, they were simply advised to by the Reagan administration. And they did it.
There wasn't any like backlash?
Oh, sure, there's
And
backlash, there's backlash, sure. Given all this, however, guiding factor for many, many, many years of broadcasting. And summed up in an acronym, PICON. And that is that broadcasting as that scarce resource, that public resource belonging to the American people, licensees should always operate out of the public interest, convenience, and necessity. Public interest, convenience, and necessity of the American people. This was to be the guiding theory, the guiding principle behind everything that the FCC does in terms of licensing. Everything they do in terms of was to assure that commercial broadcasting, because people could make lots of money by owning these licenses, that they would always work with a public interest, convenience, and necessity.
What's the O for it?
This part of convenience. Or
What you said, necessity?
necessity, yeah. Yeah, that is right. Corey corrected me, and that's right. Public convenience or necessity. So they had the word in there, convenience or necessity. Public interest, convenience or necessity. What does that mean if they're operating out of this idea of icon? For the people. For the people, right? Really? Yeah. What does that mean? If we're saying that broadcasting is for the people, yeah.
And that might be like a reach, but they kind of come like with their own, not censoring, but like what they broadcast, they kind of doing it in the public interest of people, so they kind of not to what they do broadcast.
Yeah. In the public interest, for the people, for the good of the people, for the sake of the good for the people. What do you think about today's broadcasting? Terrible? Does it operate out of the public interest, convenience, or necessity of the public? Who says yes? There's white, okay, defend yourself.
At least for the public interest part, but I know like radio, when I do listen to it, it does have everything that people are interested in, so I know that's like the public interest part. Now necessity and convenience, that might be a little cloudy.
Okay, so let's back up on this. So necessity means things people really need to know, right? Okay, there are those who would argue, and I would argue as well, that honest advertising is something that is helpful to people and making good decisions and what's good with money. Go to you,
Oh, I didn't mean to interject.
Oh, that's fine, please.
I just kind of want to say, I feel like there's still like the framework of that, because we still have like, what do you call it, like public like the emergency alert systems, you've got different things like that. We do only have, one public radio, although that, I guess that's more so all over.
Which might be going away.
Which, yeah, is gonna be funded, but, I don't know, I feel like it's not that way anymore, but it definitely has the capabilities to still have those things, but
Okay.
as, I don't know, capitalism finds a way, I guess.
Okay. Caitlin, you were going to say absolutely not.
Yeah, no, I think terrestrial radio besides NPR, works solely for money.
Just solely for money.
Yeah.
Okay, so necessity is about things that people absolutely need to do what? To go about your daily life, to operate in what we consider a democracy, right? A representative democracy that we're a part of. Other than NPR or some of the other Pacificas, et cetera. Does anyone disagree with Caitlin? Or the occasional well-done ad that is, in fact, informational more than just wanting money.
Right.
Do we operate out of for the necessity of the public? Tashana?
I was just gonna say I agree with what she's saying because everything is bought up like by big corporations. So we've lost local radio where we would go and get where we would know what was going on in our local communities. But when we now listen to it, I like 95.5, 100.3, and 104.1. But they all today had the exact same commercial on at the exact same time.
That's
So
because they're all being broadcast out of one central place somewhere over in Wichita or someplace.
Yeah.
There are very few that actually have their people in the same location as people are listening, as their audience.
I don't know that many people really look to the radio anymore to get their news. I mean, like very brief news.
This also applies to television though as well.
Yeah.
Oh,
Well, and like I listen to The Point a lot because I turn music, and like they talked. I was listening yesterday, and they were talking about like all the propositions that are up in St. Louis and stuff like that. And so I was like, that's like necessity. That's local. You know, like I mean, it's still like you said, the framework is still there.
The framework is there.
Yeah.
When I was a kid, I keep going back all those years, but there was something that was called public interest broadcasting. Every Sunday morning, television stations were required, radio stations were required to create broadcasting that helped connect people with their communities, to understand what was going on in local politics, local culture, etc. Some stations still have it, but it's no longer the requirement.
Yeah, I was just gonna piggyback on what she said. Point is like one of the only stations around that still is a local station owned by MS Communications. I only know that because my mom works there. It's KC 95, it used to be KS 96.
96.
It's called the Powerhouse. It's right there by Union Station. If you ever go to the Blues game, you see that the Powerhouse has got that big smokestack looking thing right by Union. That's where all that broadcasts. But has anyone heard of 104.9, the new? That's like a cookie cutter. That's like a iHeartMedia national station.
Yeah, it shows.
Right, yeah. Sure. They try to localize it a little bit. They put the Woody show. Woody used to work for MS, you know. So we're kind of definitely getting away from local.
So the idea, again, behind PyCon is, yes, we want to. The Radio Act, all the way back to 1912, said people should make money. We're a capitalist society. We want to be able to help people make money. However, the guiding interest from 24 on was that it should always work in the public interest, convenience or necessity. Convenience. Necessity being providing what's absolutely essential for us to participate in our culture, in our communities. Convenience, that it is accessible and convenient to everybody, and that it works in the public interest. This was a guiding principle over money. Making money was supposed to come as an afterthought to this. Nothing wrong with making money. But this was the most important because the airwaves belong to you. And they still do.
Legislative talk.
I promise I'll never run for political office. Far too many skeletons in my closet. Who would argue that this has not just been reversed? Some attention is being paid to this, but most of it has been to make money. And the FCC, and the administrations over the FCC, and Congress, who of course is the one who, through statutory law, gives administrative law the right to pass these types of regulations, have pretty much looked the other way. Primarily because it's benefited them. Someone over here in the hand up, I'm sorry. Anyone over here? Yeah, I'll test it.
Do the military, I guess, I don't want to say radio station, the military
the radio frequency? So they have to follow FCC guidelines. Because I would imagine those things are not distributed to the public.
No, it's a different situation with military transmissions. Now, base stations, and a lot of military bases have their own radio stations. They do have to adhere to certain FCC regulations. Indeed.
And are those stations privately owned or they government?
Or the government, that's government, yep. Yep. Okay. Do you wanna make a good argument that this is, again, I'm obviously, you probably know where I stand on this, but does anyone wanna make an argument that, well, this is what happens in a capitalist society?
I feel like that's how you can argue that the convenience is still there though. Because that's the reason every car we ever get into has a radio, is because all those ads that all pays for the content to be there, and that pays for that convenience of it just being a flick of the switch.
Why, I'm serious, no ads.
But you also pay us.
I pay a lot of money for that, it's ridiculous, yeah.
So, that's for sure.
Yes. But I could not live without my BBC and my Broadway channel, so, I've talked about that. Yeah.
Do you, in your honest opinion, do you feel like you're in the minority in regards to people that seek the news or seek enlightenment from radio?
I don't think I'm in the minority of the people, number one, who need it, nor who would seek it out if they knew where to get it.
I think I agree with you.
I think all of us, we're a very privileged group in here. We've studied this. We understand this in ways that the average person doesn't. And I think that if you were to go to friends or family and say, did you know that radio and TV is supposed to work out for us in our interest? I think mostly they'd say, what are you talking about? Yeah.
I also think like, I don't think there's a big pushback on that, like that, questioning that, because we have like things like Spotify that have, whatever, listen to Broadway, is that what you said? Like they have like all these different types. And so I mean you can go, or even like, NPR can stream off that,
Yeah.
so every car has an aux cord, like, so.
Yep.
That's what I was.
But again, it's whether, no, please.
No, I was saying that's what I was getting at, because the average person nowadays doesn't listen to the traditional radio. They have their own personal iTunes or Sirius satellite radio.
Extremely narrow casting. When we're talking about casting, it's not even broadcasting. It's however you're getting it.
Right.
Exactly what you want.
Exactly what you want. That was gonna lead me to my last question.
Yeah. I still have you for almost 30 minutes.
Talk about relative concept.
Okay, hold on until Chris finishes, and then I'll go back here.
Because it's kind of backwards. It's like you're supposed to, as a licensee, to practice, this idealistic concept, but at the same time, you can't promote foreign ownership. You're slightly racist in some points in regards to hiring, where someone can get so far as long as they're not seeking ownership, and then you're hiring people that are your program directors and disc jockeys. And I guess at the time, they were dealing with issues like payola, they were dealing with licenses being given under the table or for favors. So who is policing this? Because all of this is basically supposed to be under the umbrella of FCC
Also
guidelines.
the FCC and the regulations. I mean, the FCC has been granted power by Congress to do things such as fine and literally pull away a license for violations. How often do you think that happens? Practically never. Never. Fines more often. But these companies can afford to pay.
Right, because you said as long as they're sustaining themselves for over 3 years or 90 days or so, they obviously don't need radio money to run a radio station.
Right.
Oh, I was gonna say, this kinda reminds me of like, I was getting trained for web radio, and the guy who was training us was like, talking about the FCC regulations and stuff, and things that you can do on web radio, things you can't, versus like WSIE.
Right.
And he was like, WSIE is definitely regulated by FCC, but web radio is regulated by the FCC.
Right. Well, it's different. We're going to talk, when we talk about the First Amendment protection, there's a very important case called Reno versus ACLU. You don't have to, I'm going to talk about it on Thursday. There's actually Janet Reno, who was the Attorney General under President Clinton. And it was that case that said, the web is more like print than it is like broadcast in terms of First Amendment rights. So we're gonna get to that. The two gentlemen up there almost in the corner.
We're talking about how the internet plays in all this, basically, the same thing.
And how
Okay.
it all comes back to telecom because everyone operates off the phone and all this now.
Okay.
To access the internet, you have to go through telecom companies, so I mean, it's a matter of time before that becomes the next.
And like net neutrality, like if they limit, would that be freedom of like speech and breaking that and stuff? But
I want to bring up excellent point, and we do have to get into like these other cases like ACLU, Reno University. Closing today, I wanted to bring up a couple of things. Ben, you pointed to one. Again, the idea that broadcasting should operate in public interest, convenience and necessity as the guiding factor. I've mentioned this name before, and I don't know whether it's in my cultural studies class or in my ethics class, but anyone remember that name, Richard Minow? Who is Richard Minow? It's a great name.
Was it late in the semester or beginning?
I don't recall.
I do not recall
Wait. He was the FCC commissioner, the head of the FCC under John F. Kennedy. So look how far back we're going. We're going back to the very early 1960s, when we had much more regulation. The FCC's own head commissioner said that broadcasting, specifically television, amounted to a vast wasteland.
Yeah, he talked about this in media.
Vast wasteland. That doesn't sound like something that's operating out of the public interest, convenience, or necessity. This was the era, of course, where you could turn on TV and see a weekly television show about a man whose mother died and was reincarnated as his car. Called My Mother the Car. Or a man who had a talking horse. Oh, Mr. Ed.
So they'd show that stuff, but not Elvis's hips.
They wouldn't show Elvis's hips. We live in kind of a dumb country.
You don't have to tell me that.
That won't be on the So think about all the way back in the early 60s. Following, the 50s were considered like the golden era of television. Remarkable shows. Live television shows. Showing opera and classic music live. And then we go into these programs that just are there to kind of amuse us. So we had a vast wasteland. Now getting to up in, this is early 1960s, early 1960s. 2017. Net neutrality. This can be on your quiz on Thursday. This will not. I want you to be thinking about it. What's happening with net neutrality?
they want to profit off the internet.
By doing what? What does this basically say?
Trying to structure it. You're trying to put like limits, like bigger websites will have like faster speeds and stuff as far as I understand.
Yeah. Net neutrality was the idea that no matter how much money you had, the speed of the internet should be the same. And that was to address issues like the digital divide, so that people who have very few resources, you know, they're not having a dial-up modem still. The Trump administration wants to do away with this, so that whoever can pay the most gets the fastest speeds.
Which restricts the content that you can see.
Right, which restricts the content you can see. What does the Trump administration also want to do about ISPs, your internet service provider?
Oh, they want to track what you look at.
Yes,
They wanna
he wants
sell
to
that.
overturn an Obama administration rule that says that like Google or Facebook, your ISP, whoever you getting your provider of internet, will be able to track and make copies of every place you go on the internet and sell that information to companies that want that information to target you, to sell you ads.
The reason that's such a big deal though is because Google and those other places, you voluntarily give that
Yes.
information. With your ISPs, you're paying them, so now you're basically paying them to like, you're the good, you're the consumer.
You are paying them
Yeah,
to
you're
be
the
able, you're paying them and giving them the ability to spy on you at the exact same time.
to make money off.
How many people, I don't care what kind of places you go to, again, I have skeletons in my closet. However, I don't like the idea of my entire history on the internet being able to be sold. So think of that in terms of, just in terms of this, we're going, again, the internet is different. The internet is different than broadcasting. We're going to talk about, and that's Thursday, which is our last big, Thursday is our last big lecture day. So it's going to be broad ideas, big ideas.
There's
Okay?
2 more quizzes, right?
2 quizzes, a quiz Thursday, a quiz Tuesday, and then we start our extra credit hypotheticals. Be sure that you get into, decide who you want to be in groups with.
There's so much potential out there.